I sent the signal, I believed someone would answer. That was the belief of someone who had never been invisible. My name is Laren Ost, and I was the senior relay technician aboard listening station Veld Marginal 7, which is a bureaucratic way of saying I ran a dead post on the fringe of a system no one in the research lab had cared about for 112 years. The station orbited a gas giant we called Marindole, a slow brown bruiser with 12 moons and no mineral value and no strategic position and no reason for the collective to look our way. We had 6 staff, we had 1 emergency beacon. We had a comms array that was old when my grandmother's grandmother was young, and we had an unbroken record, going back 4 generations of relay technicians, of transmitting our quarterly status reports to the collective grid and receiving automated acknowledgement in return. The acknowledgement was not a sign that anyone was listening. I understood that, the way you understand things you have been told, but have not yet lived. The acknowledgement arrived at 22 seconds after transmission, every time, regardless of what was happening on the collective grid, regardless of network load or regional disruptions or anything else that should have created variation in the response time. 22 seconds was the interval for a fully automated system, a system that received input, logged it, and returned a confirmation without the signal ever touching a living node. But I had been telling myself it was something. The way a lamp in a window feels like a sign, even when you know it's on a timer. Then the acknowledgement stopped. It stopped on a morning in the 93rd cycle of my posting, and I spent the first 2 hours assuming it was a calibration fault on our end. I ran the diagnostic twice. I pulled the buffer logs. I reseated the array's primary coupling, which I had done 40 times before, and which always solved the problem when the problem was mechanical. The coupling seated cleanly. The array's self-test returned nominal on every subsystem. The signal was going out clean and strong. Nothing was coming back. I sent a direct query to the collective's emergency coordination channel. The channel received the query. I could see the receipt confirmation in the handshake log, a small green indicator that should have meant something, but, as I was beginning to understand, meant only that the packet had arrived. Not that anything with a mind had seen it. The collective simply did not respond. The green indicator sat there, and I sat there looking at it, and the silence stretched. This confused me for approximately 1 standard day. Then, on the 2nd day, a supply drone failed to arrive on its scheduled run. The drone had never missed a run in 11 years. Its absence was not explained by any automated dispatch notification. It had simply been removed from the routing schedule, and no one had sent word. On the 3rd day, I understood. The station had been dropped from the collective grid, not decommissioned. There had been no decommission order, no formal notice, no administrative transmission of any kind, not evacuated. We were still here, 6 of us, in functional suits, with our equipment running and our logs updated and our morning reports filed. We had simply stopped appearing in the network's active registry. Somewhere in the collective's vast bureaucratic architecture, an error or a decision or a quiet administrative convenience had marked us as non-existent, and the collective, which perceived only what its registry confirmed, had acted accordingly. It had stopped seeing us. I want to explain what it means to be invisible to the Veld collective, because it is not quite the same thing as being ignored. Humans have a concept of being overlooked, of standing in a room, and having people fail to register your presence even though you are plainly there. That is a human experience of imperfect attention. What happened to listening station Veld Marginal 7 was different in kind. The collective is not a single mind, and it is not a government. Not the way the word implies deliberate authority. Is a network of chemical and electromagnetic signals so dense and so interwoven that for a Veld cluster, perceiving and existing are nearly the same verb. The Veld evolved on a world where the atmosphere itself carried biological signal, where the air was a medium for continuous, species-wide communication, and where an organism that could not emit and receive in that medium was functionally absent from reality. Not hidden, absent. The chemistry of Veld cognition does not have a category for a thing that is present, but not signaling in the correct register. Such a thing is not an enemy. It is not a mystery. It is simply not categorized as existent, and what is not categorized as existent generates no response, Because generating a response to nothing is, by definition, irrational behavior. If you emit the right signals, you exist. If your signal drops off the registry, you do not. There is no malice in it. There is no cruelty. There is simply the architecture of a species that evolved in a world where signal was everything, and silence was death. And nothing that was silent could logically still be alive. We were silent, as far as the collective was concerned, and so we were dead. My crew took this in different ways. As crews do, when the institutional certainties they have built their professional lives around are quietly removed from underneath them. Ensign Dalveen, who had come to the post straight from the academy and still believed in institutional order the way young people believe in it, before institutions fail them personally, spent the first week writing formal appeals to 6 different collective oversight bodies. She drafted them carefully in the correct format, with the correct headers and identification codes, and cross-references to the relevant collective administrative statutes. The appeals went unanswered. After the second week, she stopped writing them, but she kept the drafts in a folder she never deleted. And sometimes, I would see her open the folder and sit there looking at it without doing anything. I did not tell her to delete it. It was hers. Technician Carver laughed about it. A hard, clipped laugh with no humor behind it. The kind of laugh that is a reflex and not an emotional expression, and started a log he titled, "Days Since Anyone Out There Gave a Damn," which he updated each morning with the same cheerless precision he brought to every other maintenance record. He updated it accurately and consistently, the way you update something that matters to you. Senior analyst Fen Morst, who had been at the station longer than any of us, longer than I had, longer than anyone on the current crew, said only, "We are not the first." When I asked her what she meant, she walked me to the archive room and showed me the logs. The logs went back 4 generations. They had been kept by every relay technician who served at Veld Marginal 7, in a practice that was not part of any official protocol. The collective had no formal requirement for personal station logs, only quarterly operational reports, but which had been passed down from one technician to the next as something close to a tradition. Not an explicit instruction, not a formal handover procedure, simply something you found when you took the posting and understood without being told, and continued. The logs were not operational records, they were personal. They were the record of what it felt like to work here. The long quiet, the routine maintenance, the particular quality of the gas giant's light through the observation port on certain mornings when the atmosphere was doing something spectacular. The small moments of competence and boredom, and occasional inexplicable satisfaction that make up the interior life of a technical posting. No one of consequence is watching, and now and then, surfacing through the procedural entries like a current under still water, a note about the silence, about the feeling that no one was watching, about the understanding that crept over you slowly if you were here long enough, that the collective had never really been paying attention to this place, and that the people who kept it running were doing so largely on faith that the work mattered. In a universe that was not doing much to confirm that faith, the earliest entry in the archive that addressed the silence directly was from a technician named Alori Vell, who had held my post 83 years before me. She had written in the flat and practical style that characterized all 4 generations of this archive. Quarterly report sent. Automated acknowledgement received at 1442. I have been noting for some time that the acknowledgement arrives exactly 22 seconds after transmission, regardless of collective network load. I have tested this. I sent during the network disruption of cycle 412, when regional traffic was running 60% over normal. The acknowledgement still arrived at 22 seconds. This is the interval for a fully automated response that touches no living node. No one reads these reports. Do not think the collective knows we are here. I intend to keep sending regardless. What else would I do? I read that entry standing in the archive room with Fenmorst beside me, and I felt the kind of vertigo that has nothing to do with altitude. The vertigo of realizing that what you are standing in is much larger than what you thought you were standing in. This woman had been dead for 60 years. She had kept this station alive for 9 years of a posting that the collective had never seen and she had known it, and she had understood it fully, and she had kept sending anyway, from hope, not from denial, from what she described in a later entry as the refusal to accept that the correct response to not being heard is to stop speaking. I thought about Lori Vell a great deal in the months that followed. We lost external power coupling on day 41 of the silence. Failure was gradual, a cascade through the secondary junction that our diagnostics caught early enough to manage, but not early enough to prevent. The station's core was still functional, but we were drawing on reserve batteries, and we had no way to recharge them. The coupling required a repair component we did not have and could not fabricate, and there was no supply drone on its way to bring us one. We calculated, with the careful pessimism that technical people adopt when the math is unfavorable, that we had approximately 400 days of reserve power before the station went dark entirely. We began rationing. I pulled every non-essential system offline. We went to low heat, which was not dangerous, but was persistently uncomfortable in a way that accumulated over days and weeks, and began to affect the quality of everything, of thought, of conversation, of the small interactions that hold a small crew together. Killed the external observation sensors. We killed the maintenance drones. We lived, 6 of us, in 3 compartments and the control room, in the cold and the quiet, and I kept the comms array running because the comms array was the only thing I could think to do. The array was drawing power I could not easily justify. I justified it anyway. It was not a rational decision. It was the kind of decision that feels necessary and is difficult to explain, and I have learned to trust those decisions more than I did when I was younger. Dalveen asked me, on day 60, why I kept sending. I told her, because if I stop then we are actually invisible. As long as I send we are only ignored. Those are different conditions and they matter. She thought about that for a while. Then she asked, who are you sending to? And I told her the truth, which was that I didn't know yet. I had already sent to the collective's emergency channel 17 times. I had sent to the regional coordination hub. I had sent to the collective scientific oversight buddy, whose frequency we technically fell under since we were classified as a research support station. I had sent to the system's traffic relay, which had no one staffing it, but which would log received signals in a buffer that someone, theoretically, might someday review. I had sent to the nearest inhabited station 47 light minutes away, which had its own problems and had responded once to say it could do nothing for us. None of this had produced a substantive response. I was sending into the correct places and receiving nothing, which meant the correct places were either unable to help me or had decided not to. On day 88, I found the old frequency bands. The station's archive contained, alongside the personal logs, a complete technical history of the array itself. The array had been in continuous operation, in various configurations, for over 120 years. In that time, it had been updated many times, but the updates had been additive rather than replacements. Old hardware was left in place when new modules were installed, because replacing functional hardware costs resources, and the collective had no interest in spending resources on a marginal station. The array was therefore a layered thing, old configurations coexisting with newer ones, dormant but present, frequency bands that had been standard in earlier eras of interstellar communication, before the collective standardized its grid. Bands that the collective had not used in a long time. Bands that were, technically, still physically present in the hardware. Most of them were dead. I tried 7 of them before I tried the 8th. The 8th band had a name in the archive's technical glossary, rendered in a transliteration that suggested it came from outside collective terminology. The archive's gloss read, Pre-Coalition Emergency Frequency, declared non-standard by Collective Technical Directive 7, in the reformatting of the common grid. No active collective installation should be found on this frequency, known to have been used by non-collective entities in early interstellar period. Status, dormant. I stared at the words non-collective entities for a long time. Then I sent. The signal I sent on that frequency was the same signal I had been sending for 88 days. Identification, position, status, reserve power estimate, summary of events. I added at the end the archive packet. Not just my own entries, all of them. Lori Bell, and Memiset, and Toran, and Voslin, and the 4 generations of technical records that documented, in patient and precise detail, the existence of people who had kept a signal alive from a post the collective had never really seen. I sent the archive because it seemed right, because the archive was the truth of this place. And whoever was listening deserved the truth. I did not expect an answer. I had been rebuilding my expectations downward for 88 days, and I had arrived at a state that was not quite hope and not quite hopelessness, but something more like resolution. The decision to continue the act regardless of the result, because the act itself was the only thing that distinguished us from the silence we were sending into. Alori Vell had described this better than I can. I was borrowing her clarity. On day 91, the array's receiver lit. I was in the control room when it happened, alone on the night rotation, halfway through a maintenance log that I had been finding difficult to complete because the cold made my hands stiff. The light was a single amber pulse, the old protocol's handshake signal, the one the collective no longer used, the one from the pre-coalition era that should have found no active receiver anywhere within our broadcast range. I watched it pulse 3 times, then I watched the buffer fill, a voice transmission, pressed, clean, startlingly clear for a signal that had crossed the distance it had crossed. My translation matrix parsed it into standard registry language without difficulty, and I read the translation in the buffer while the audio was still playing. The voice said, "Listening station Veldmarnal 7, this is SOS Marjorie Kai, we have your signal. We have had your signal for 17 days. We have been on course to your position for 12 days. Estimated arrival at Marindol system is 14 standard days from this transmission. We received the archive packet. We have read the archive. Keep broadcasting on this frequency. Do not shift to collective standard bands. We are on approach. Heard you." A brief pause, then quieter. "We read about Alori Vell. We know her. Keep broadcasting. We are coming." I sat at the console for a long time without moving. I ran the authentication on the signal 4 times. Not a ghost echo, not a reflection, not a bureaucratic artifact. The origin signature matched a vessel registry that my translation matrix identified as Terran human, a species I knew primarily from the collective's archival records, which described them in the dry, administrative language the collective uses for all entities it has categorized and filed. A medium technology species of the inner systems, treaty adjacent, not a threat, not currently relevant. The text of its records were 17 years out of date, which I noted. I did not know what that meant yet. What I knew was that someone had been on that frequency. Someone had been listening. Someone had read Alori Vell's words and said her name and was 14 days away and coming to our position. I woke Fenmorst first. She was the only other person who had been here long enough, who knew the archive well enough, to understand what I needed to say in the specific way I needed to say it. I went to her quarters and I turned the light on, and she was already sitting up by the time I reached her bedside, because Fenmorst had a light sleeper's reflex and had probably heard me moving in the corridor. I said, "Alori Vell's sent for 90 years, and now someone answered." Fensmorst sat up and looked at me for a moment. Face was very still. Then she said, "What kind of ship?" I told her I didn't know yet. I told her only that the designation prefix was Terran human, and that the vessel had been on course for 12 days before the transmission. She said, "How many days until they arrive?" 14. She nodded. She pulled her coverall on. She said, "Then we have time. Wake the others. Tell them something answered." I told them in the control room with all 6 of us present, and I played the audio transmission, and I watched their faces while the voice spoke. Dalveen put her hand over her mouth. Carver closed the log on his terminal, the one labeled, "Days since anyone out there gave a damn," and I heard him close it, and he did not reopen it for the rest of our time on the station. 2 junior technicians, Hassel and Pren, looked at each other and then looked at me, and something in their faces was so raw and so young and so relieved that I had to look away for a moment to collect myself. They were not performing relief. They had been carrying something for 91 days, and something had just been removed from them. And the removal was visible. Didn't let them see that I felt it too, but I felt it. In the 14 days that followed, I sent to the SOS Marjorie Kai every 6 hours. They responded to every transmission. The voice that answered was the same voice each time, their comms officer, who identified herself only by her station designation, Comms 1, which I thought was strange. I asked her name once, on day 3 of our communications, and she said with a dry precision that I would come to recognize as the characteristic register of her personality. The fleet has me listed as deceased. I find it simpler, professionally, to operate under my function title until the paperwork catches up. A brief, neutral pause. "How is your power reserve?" I told her. She said, "Hold on." Over the next 12 days, I learned, through careful conversation and the intelligence reports, that the Marjorie Kai's commander chose to share with us what was coming. The Veld, not the research collective, the biological collective intelligence, that the collective's network was an expression of, the deep organizational organism underneath the bureaucracy, had been propagating through this sector for 6 months. Not in the way military force expands, which implies intent and strategy, and a command structure capable of decision. The Veld does not operate that way. The Veld propagates as a field propagates, outward from itself in all directions, at a rate determined by available energy density, incorporating what it encounters and passing over what it does not register. Stations, ships, populations. If you were already part of the Veld network, if you emitted the correct chemical and electromagnetic signature, if you appeared in the registry as an existing node, you were incorporated, extended, continued. If you were not part of the network, you were background noise. Background noise is not harmed. Background noise is simply not registered. It is passed through. But background noise still needs power. Background noise still has a remaining life expectancy, measured in whatever reserve is left. The Veld field had entered the outer edges of the Marindol system on day 4 of our wait for the Marjorie Kai. We tracked it on the array's passive sensors. Not with the precision our full sensor suite would have provided, but clearly enough to understand what we were looking at. It moved through the system in the slow, continuous pattern of biological propagation. It was not fast. It was not hurried. It did not need to be. It entered the outer orbital band and continued inward. And when it reached the first point of proximity to the station, it did what the Veld always do. It received the station's electromagnetic signature, processed it against the network registry, found no match, and categorized it as non-existent background. Then it continued. I spent 3 hours watching it pass on the array and trying to find the right frame for what I was seeing. Because the frame matters when you have to explain a thing to a crew that is frightened and looking to you for orientation. I could not find a frame that made the experience comfortable, so I settled for making it accurate. I gathered everyone in the control room while the field was still on the passive sensor display, and I told them, "The thing on this screen cannot see us. It is not choosing to ignore us. It is not building up to an attack. Its architecture does not include a category for us. To the field, we occupy the same position as the cold gas of the outer orbital zone. Present, emitting weakly, categorized as non-living background. This is not a comfort exactly, but it is the truth, and the truth has a specific value when everything else is uncertain. It does not change on you." I asked. "If it can't see us, why does it matter that the humans are coming?" I said. "Because we are running out of power, and when we lose power, we lose the comms array. And when we lose the comms array, we stop broadcasting. And when we stop broadcasting, we are not merely invisible to the Veld field. We are invisible in the way that Alori Vel feared. The way that you can no longer call yourself only ignored. Are simply gone," he understood. They all understood. We were not in danger from the Veld's attention. We were in danger from its indifference, which had always been the more honest description of what we were facing. Field did not need to harm us. It only needed to continue, and our station would run down, and we would go quiet, and the system would contain one fewer signal in the dark. I watched it on the passive sensors, 6 of us in the control room, and I think we each understood, in those hours, something that the archive had been documenting for 4 generations without anyone reading it. This was what the silence had always been. Not bureaucratic negligence, not technical error. The deep architecture of a civilization that had built its entire cognitive infrastructure around signal registration, and for whom anything that did not register simply was not there. The collective had not failed to read Alori Vel's reports because it was careless. It had failed to read them because it was, in its deepest organizational structure, incapable of perceiving something that was not already part of its network. We had been sending our quarterly reports to an entity that at the most fundamental level lacked the cognitive category for entities like us. We had been sending to the wrong species, Dalveen said. At some point during those hours, with the quiet of someone who has been working something out for a long time and has finally reached the conclusion, I thought the silence was our fault. I thought if we just sent the right signal to the right address, in the right format, someone would answer. I said, I thought that too, for a long time. What changed? She said, I found the archive. I found Alori Vel and Memiset before her, and Toran and Voslin before them. 4 generations of people who sent the right signal in the right format to the right address and got nothing back and kept sending. And I understood the silence was never about us. She thought about that then. But they answered, the humans. They answered. I said, she says. Why them and not the collective? I said, I don't know exactly. Think. It has something to do with the old frequency. The collective declared it non-standard because the collective stopped needing it. They had their own grid, their own architecture, everything routed through their own network. The old frequency was for reaching outside the network, for reaching things the network didn't already include. She was quiet for a moment. So the collective built a communications infrastructure that only connects to things it already knows exist. I said, yes, she said, and the humans kept listening on the frequency that connects to everything else. I said yes. She sat with that for a while. Then she said, someone should have told us that 4 generations ago. She was right. Someone should have. The Veld field reached the outer edge of our direct orbital zone on day 9 of the wait. The Marjorie Kai was still 5 days out. The field's propagation brought it to within 200,000 kilometers of the station, and I watched the passive array the entire time, and the field moved past us without any variation in its trajectory. We did not exist. We were background noise. The field had no reason to harm us, and no reason to notice us, and it exercised both of those capacities with absolute consistency. Those 9 days were the hardest part of the whole ordeal, in a way that the 112 days before them were not. Before the Marjorie Kai answered, the silence had its own grim integrity. You had nothing to lose by doing the work. You sent, you maintained the array, you watched the power numbers, you kept going. After the answer, you had something to lose. The wait was no longer endurance. It was exposure. I dealt with it with the way I had been dealing with the worst parts of the posting. I went back to the archive. I had not read all of it. There was too much, and in the early cycles, I had been too busy with the operational problems to do more than sample. Now, with the Marjorie Kai inbound in the Veld field circling and 63 days of power left in our reserves, I started at the beginning and read straight through. Voslin had been the first to use the logs as a kind of deliberate practice, the first who seemed to have understood, consciously, what the archive was for. Her predecessor, Toran, had kept meticulous records of the array's maintenance, interspersed with personal observations that he apparently had not quite made up from my personal soul. They appeared in the logs, in a slightly awkward formal register, like a man writing in his own voice, while pretending he was writing an operational report. Toran noted the silence in a number of entries, each time with a small practical conclusion. He would adjust the transmission schedule, or try a different header format, or send to a different address. He was solving a problem, which was the frame he had. Problem did not solve, and he kept adjusting, and the adjustments did not accumulate into anything. But the record of the attempts was there. Voslin had taken the archive from him, and apparently read it all the way through in her first month. Her own logs, from that first month, had the character of someone thinking out loud. She wrote, Toranj tried everything that could be tried within the system. He tried every address, every format, every scheduled variation. The system did not respond. I am concluding from this that the problem is not in how we are sending. The problem is in who is receiving, or rather in who is not receiving, because we are not in their registry. FIS. I'm going to stop trying to solve the problem by changing our signal. I am going to start thinking about differently. And then 2 entries later, I think the archive is the thing. The status reports, not the emergency queries, the archive. Because the archive is the record of people who were here, and who sent, and who kept sending. And if anyone ever finds this record, anyone outside the collective's registry, anyone who is on a frequency that is not the collective's network, they will know what kind of entities left it. They will know that we kept the signal even when the signal was not answered. That is the record that matters. She was right. She could not have known in any operationally verifiable sense that she was right. She had no evidence that anyone outside the collective would ever access these logs, or would know what to do with them if they did. She was acting on a principle rather than a plan. The principle was sound, and 80 years later someone was on approach to our position because that principle had been passed down entry by entry, from Voslin to Toron to Memi Set to Alorivel to Fenmorse to me. I finished reading the archive on the night of day 8, and I sat at the console in the cold, with Marindole's light coming through the observation port, and I understood something about the station that I had not quite understood before. The station was not a relay post. It was not a scientific support installation. Those were the categories for it. The category that justified its budget line and its position in the administrative hierarchy. But that was not what the station was, not really. What the station was a practice of keeping the signal. A practice of insisting on existing even in the face of a civilization's structural inability to perceive you. 4 generations of technicians had maintained these not because I believed it would be rewarded, but because the alternative was to accept the collective's categorization of them, and not one of them had been willing to do that. I sent status to the Marjorie Kai on schedule. Comms 1 responded within 6 minutes, which was faster than the light speed delay accounted for, which meant she had been at the console waiting. She said, "We saw the propagation pass your position. You're clear for now, 5 days," I said. "Understood," she said. "Commander Chen wants you to know the formation is with us." I asked what she meant by formation. She gave me a transmission delay. Several seconds, which meant she had been waiting on Chen's authorization to release the information. Then, the Marjorie Kai is a fast frigate. We came ahead. There are 8 additional vessels on a parallel transit vector, approximately 20 hours behind us. Commander Chen will brief you fully on arrival. She wanted you to know you were not waiting for one ship, I said. How many hulls in the formation? She said, 9 including us. 1 carrier class. I said nothing for a moment. Then I said, for a 6-person station on a fringe post. Comms 1 said, for a signal on the old frequency. When the old frequency calls, we don't query the scope of the problem first. We bring what we have. I sent that transmission text to the whole crew. I watched Carver read it. I watched him close his eyes for a moment. Then, he opened them and went back to his maintenance log. But the way he held himself at the console was different. The Marjorie Kai entered the Marindole system on day 13 of the wait, and I was at the console when the transponder registered. Frigate was smaller than I had imagined from its voice. Fast and lean, with the hull profile of a vessel designed to cover distance quickly and arrive in good condition. It came to orbit above the station's approach corridor and hailed us on the old frequency, and Comms 1's voice came through with the same quality it always had on transmission. Clear, dry, entirely without ceremony. Laranost, we're in your system. Array shows you on reserve power. We'll address that first. Nation is 22 hours behind us. The Veld field was still in the inner system, propagating slowly. It had passed the station twice more. Twice more we had been categorized as background noise. Background noise runs out of reserves, and we were now at 63 days of estimated remaining power. That arithmetic was not improving. The formation arrived 22 hours later, as Comms 1 had said it would. I was awake for the arrival, and Hassel was beside me at the console. We watched the passive array as the transponder signatures resolved. The escorts first, then the destroyers, then the larger silhouettes, and then the carrier. I had been briefed on the carrier. I had reviewed its class specifications in the intelligence materials Chen had shared. None of that prepared me for watching it appear on the passive array as a return that occupied more display space than any moving object in the system except Marindole itself. Hassel said, "It's been doing this a long time, hasn't it?" I said, The hull repairs on the array signature suggest at least several decades of continuous operation, possibly longer, he said. They've been out here listening on a dead frequency for longer than we've been alive. I said yes. He said because someone has to. He had heard Comms 1's transmission. He was borrowing her words and they sounded true coming from him. We watched the formation take position. The carrier moved to the deepest point of the formation. The rear anchor, I understood from Chen's briefing, because a carrier's role in this kind of engagement was not leading edge but sustaining. It carried the communication assets, the translation team, the additional frequency range hardware that the smaller ships could not fit. The escorts and destroyers moved to form a layered arc between the carrier and the Veld field's current position. The Marjorie Kai held its station-keeping orbit near us. Chen hailed us directly when the formation was in position. Voice was different from Comms 1's. Where Comms 1 was dry and precise, Chen was quieter, slower, with a quality that I can only describe as accustomed to wait. She had been doing this for a long time, and the time showed in how she spoke. She said, Laranost. Crew at full strength, I said. All 6 present and functional. Tired, she said. Understood. You'll remain at your station during the engagement. Keep broadcasting on the old frequency. Don't shift to any other band regardless of what you observe. What I am about to do requires your signal to be part of the broadcast, not a recording of your signal. Active signal, continuing as it has been. Are you clear? I said I was clear. She said, I want you to know one more thing before we begin. A pause, the brief kind. The kind that means the next words were chosen carefully. Your archive packet arrived at the Marjorie Kai on day 18 of our monitoring rotation for this sector. One put it through to my console at 0310 station time. I read it before I read anything else that morning. I read Alori Vel and Voss Lin and the others. And I read your transmissions from day 1 through day 91. Another pause. When I finished reading, I pulled the Marjorie Kai off its assigned patrol route without filing a course deviation request with the Fleet Administrative Office. I came first and filed the paperwork afterward. I said, Is that standard procedure? She said, It is not. The standard procedure has a response window, and the response window takes longer than the old frequency deserves. Her voice was level, unhurried. The old frequency deserves an answer you don't have to wait for. Then she said, Keep broadcasting. Starting. What happened next took 4 hours, and I want to describe it honestly, which means acknowledging that the human method in this engagement was not complicated. It did not involve technology the Veld lacked. It did not involve strategies that required specialized knowledge or capabilities beyond our understanding. It involved a set of decisions made by people who understood from long practice what it meant to send a signal into silence and have no one answer. The Terran formation did not attack the Veld field. Attacking the Veld field is not operationally coherent. The field is not localized, does not have a command structure, does not concentrate into a target that can be struck. What it did was position itself in a deliberate geometry. The station and the direction of the Veld's continued propagation, occupying the space the field would have to move through to continue its passage toward the inner system. And then it broadcast, on the old frequency, on every pre-coalition emergency band the array could access, on frequencies I had not known existed, pulled from archives older than the collective's own grid. Frequencies the formation's comms array had been configured to access, with a precision that was clearly not improvised. The range of frequencies they broadcast on was larger than anything I had ever seen a comms system address simultaneously. It was, I understood later, the product of 3 centuries of listening. Every dead frequency, every dormant band, every channel that the collective and its predecessors had declared non-standard and abandoned. All of them active at once. They broadcast the station's logs. All of them. Alori Vel's entries from 83 years ago. Memiset's entries from before that. Torin's voice. A recording in a format the collective's systems could not natively decode, but which the Terran formation apparently handled without difficulty. His practical, meticulous notes on the array's maintenance schedule, and, threaded through them, his observations about the silence. Voss Lin's final entry from this post, in which she had written, in a tone of mild and resolved clarity, that she was handing the station to her successor and wished to leave one piece of advice in the log. Do not mistake the silence for an answer. The silence is not an answer. The silence is the absence of anyone paying attention. These are different conditions, and they require different responses. My own transmissions, from day 1 through day 91, and Alori Vel's entry for day 604. I have determined that the correct response to silence is not to become silent. The correct response to silence is to note, in the record, that you sent, and that no answer came, and that you intend to send again tomorrow, and the day after, and the day after that. Because the record is not for the collective. The record is for whoever eventually finds it. And whoever eventually finds it will know that someone was here. Someone kept the signal. Someone was not willing to become background noise simply because the people who should have been listening had decided not to listen. I did not know the formation was going to do this. Comms 1 had not told me in advance. Later, when I asked her why, she said, "Because we needed your voice in the broadcast record. You're better when you're not performing." What I know is what the Veld field did. It stopped. The Veld field, which had been propagating through the system in the continuous, smooth pattern of biological advance, not fast, not purposeful in any conscious sense, simply moving as a field moves, stopped its inward advance and held position. I watched it on the passive array, and I did not understand what I was seeing at first, because the Veld field does not stop. Propagation is a function of its nature, not a decision. A body of water moving downhill does not stop because it encounters new information. The field advancing through a system does not stop. The frequencies the formation was broadcasting on were, apparently, in a range the Veld signal processing architecture could receive, but had no protocol for. Not collective standard bands which the Veld absorbed seamlessly into its own network. Not the background noise of uninhabited space, something the field received as a signal. Something that could not be categorized as either network node or non-existent background. The field's enormous distributed consciousness received it and did the only thing such a system can do when it encounters an input that does not fit any of its categories. It paused propagation and allocated processing to categorization. The Veld field held position for 40 minutes. Then it sent a signal on one of the old bands. Not to us. Not to the formation itself, or to whatever self-referential process within its architecture was engaged in the work of categorization. Chen's translation team was working in real time. She relayed the parsed output to me as it came through. The Veld field was asking its own distributed cognition. What kind of entity produces this signal? Is the nature of a being that emits on frequencies outside the network's categorization range? What is the signal pattern of an organism whose record extends across multiple individual lifespans, transmitted by different individuals, from the same location, in a consistent pattern, apparently without expectation of network acknowledgement? What does it mean that the signal has continued for 83 years without network response? What is an entity that sends into silence and is not acknowledged and continues to send? The last query the translation team parsed was the one that mattered. The Veld field's distributed cognition was asking itself, what category contains a being that refuses to accept categorization as non-existent? Chen relayed that parse to me directly. She added no commentary. I sat at the console and read it, and I understood that the Veld field was not asking us. It was asking itself. It was encountering, for what appeared to be the first time in its operational existence, a signal that did not fit its binary, network node, or silence. It was encountering something that had been emitting into the network's silence for 83 years and had not stopped, and its architecture, which had evolved to process signal or categorize silence, did not have a category for this. I sent to the Marjorie Kai. Tell Commander Chen the answer is in the archive. Alori Vel wrote it. Day 604 of her posting. A pause. Then comms 1. Translating now. The translation team broadcast Alori Vel's Day 604 entry on every frequency. The Veld field held position for 6 more hours. Then it turned. Not dramatically. Not with any evident urgency. Field completed its passage through the system in a direction that took it clear of the station's orbital path. Clear of the formation's position. Clear of the inner system. out to the system edge on a vector that was geometrically unmistakable. The Veld field had updated its model. It had encountered a category it did not have, decided it needed one, and modified its propagation path accordingly. What that category was exactly, I do not know. Translation team's parse of the Veld's self-referential processing suggested something like, entities that send into silence and do not accept silence as an answer are not background noise and are not network nodes. They are a third kind of thing. They require a third kind of response. The third kind of response, as far as I could determine, was do not propagate through them. The formation helped position Nofi 3 more days while Chen's team verified the departure vector and confirmed the field was not returning. During those 3 days, the Marjorie Kai came to station keeping distance, close enough that we could see it from the observation ports we had brought back online. Stood at the port, all 6 of us, and we looked at the ship. It was not a new ship. I had known from the array returns that it was old, but seeing it from the observation port was different from seeing it as a sensor signature. The hull carried the accumulated evidence of its history. Not damage, not neglect, but the honest record of a working vessel that had been maintained carefully and used hard over a very long time. The hull plating showed variations in material, where repairs had been made with what was available. There were sections where the surface treatment had been renewed and sections where it had not, and the contrast was visible even at this distance. It was a ship that had been doing something specific for a long time, and the something specific showed. Dalveen said, "It's old." I said, "Yes," she said. "How long has it been out here?" "Listening on that frequency," I said. "I don't know exactly. Frequency was declared non-standard over 300 years ago," she said. "So they've been out here, on a dead frequency, for longer than our civilization has been in this system." I said yes. She was quiet for a while. Then, "Why?" I said. "I think because someone decided a long time ago that the official channels are for the things the official channels already know about, and the old frequency is for everything else." She turned from the observation port and looked at me. She said, "We were the everything else, yes." Comms 1 arranged the docking transfer and came across herself in a utility shuttle with a small technical team and a quantity of portable power cells that was considerably more than a minimum viable rescue quantity. She had thought about what we would need, and she had brought more than what she thought, because she had come from a tradition that over-delivers when it answers a signal on the old frequency. I met her at the docking ring. She was compact, direct, with the air of someone who had learned to do a great deal with limited resources, and had long since stopped finding that condition remarkable. Fleet Jacket had no name patch, only the function designation, Comms 1, F's Marjorie Kai. We shook hands. She looked around the docking ring, the jury-rigged lighting, the cold, the evidence of 90-odd days of living carefully in reduced circumstances, and she said nothing about any of it. People who have been doing hard things for a long time recognize the evidence of other people doing hard things, and they do not treat it as remarkable or pitiable. It is simply what it is. I shook her hand and said, "You knew about Alori Vel before you came," she said. "She's been in the fleet's recovered signal archive for 40 years. We know all of them. Everyone who kept a dead frequency alive. She said it the way you say something that is a fact, not a sentiment. You're in it now too. Your transmissions from day 1 through day 91. Commander Chen added them before we entered the system." I said, "Why day 91? She said, "Because day 91 was when you sent the archive packet on the old frequency. That was when we received it. That was the transmission that reached us." She paused. 17 transmissions you sent on collective standard bands before that. Those were also in the packet, logged. We know you sent them. We know they weren't answered." I said nothing. She said more quietly, "I know what it is to send and not be answered. I know what it costs to keep the signal going when the people who should be listening have decided you don't exist." She looked at me steadily. "The fleet has me listed as deceased. A records error 6 years ago. I've been working on correcting it. In the meantime, I operate under my function title. I send my status reports every quarter to the Fleet Administrative Registry, and I receive no acknowledgement because my service number is classified as non-active. I monitor the old frequency because it is the only channel I know of that still reaches entities outside the existing network. Entities the network does not already know are there, she said. When your signal came through, I was at the console, through to Commander Chen in about 30 seconds. I said, because you understood what it was, she said. Because I understood what it costs to send into silence and keep sending. Because Alori Vel's voice was in the archive packet, and I know her voice, and I knew what I was receiving. We stood there for a moment. The shuttle crew was already moving equipment through the docking ring behind her. The power cells, the cabling, the new array components, the medical kit, she had apparently decided. We probably needed whether we had asked for it or not. I said, why you personally? You could have sent the technical team across, she said. I've been on the old frequency for 6 years. I've received 4 signals in that time. Each one was someone in a situation roughly like yours. Not in immediate physical danger, but invisible to their own infrastructure running down in the silence. She looked at me. Come across every time. I find it important to come across, I asked. What happened to the other 3? She said, 2 are operational. 1 decommissioned, but the crew was resettled. They're all in the archive. A pause. Check on them. I had not thought about that. That there might be a practice of checking. That the answer might not end at rescue, I said. You check on stations you've responded to, she said. We check on signals in the archive, all of them, including the ones who are gone. Alori Vel is in the archive. We send a notation to her entry every year on the anniversary of her first log entry. Not to anyone, because there is no one to send it to, just to the record. Because the record deserves to know it is being read. I thought about Alori Vel sitting at this console 83 years ago, writing in the cold. I thought about the fleet she had never known about, maintaining her record in an archive she had never known existed, checking on her work across decades. She would have been glad to know. Comms 1 said, yes, I expect she would have. Then she said, your power reserve first. We can talk more while we work. The formation departed the Marindol system after 72 hours. The Marjorie Kai stayed another 2 days, completing a full repair assessment and leaving us with power cells, array components, and the new comms module that Comms 1 installed herself, working alongside Carver and Pren, with the focused competence of someone who does not separate the maintenance from the mission. When the module was in and tested, she calibrated the old frequency band first, before anything else. Then she checked the full range, and then she said, the new module has broader coverage on the old bands than your previous array. If there's another station out here on a dead frequency, you'll hear it now. I asked. Does that happen? She said, more often than it should. That's why we monitor. The Marjorie Kai undocked on a morning in the 172nd cycle of my posting. I watched their departure vector on the array until the ship reached the system edge and transitioned. I watched the old frequency return to its quiet. Then I sent a standard status report. Equipment nominal. Count 6. Power reserve restored. Array upgraded. No active threats. 1 added line. At the end, in the section no one at the collective reads. In the record that would go into the archive, when I eventually passed this post to whoever came after me, the old frequency was declared non-standard. Ignore that. Keep it in the array configuration. Monitor it at all times. If you hear something on it, answer. Do not query the scope of the problem first. Do not wait for authorization, answer. Because someone has to. The automated acknowledgement from the collective grid came back at 22 seconds. As it always had, as it always would. It touched no living node, no one read it. I filed it and went back to work. The station was still cold. Pairs were not finished. There was a great deal left to do. I had known that when I sat down at the console to send my first signal into the silence, 79 days before the F's, Marjorie Kai had appeared on the passive array. I had known it when I found Alori Vel's voice in the archive, and Voss Lin's, and the others. People who had done the work in a place no one was watching, not for recognition, not from certainty of outcome, but because the work was the work, and the signal was the signal, and refusing to become background noise was the only answer available to them. It is the only answer available to me too. I keep sending.